Hey there. Have you ever thought about the process of making decisions or how that even takes place? My name is Fernando, and today we're going to be talking about the medial prefrontal cortex and a very interesting study done in Germany. The medial prefrontal cortex is known for executive functioning and decision making. For example, making the decision of the outfit for you for the day, or for example, making the decision to travel somewhere by walking or by car. All of these decisions that you make during the day are essentially made in medial prefrontal cortex. And this is really important when we're going to be talking about this really cool study that looked into the organization and also selectivity of brain cells in mice. This study done by Sandra Reinert et al. In 2019 talks about the categorization and selectivity of mice when they're exposed to a specific stimulus. By categorization, I mean simply the way in which things are grouped together. In this case, in which brain cells are grouped together. Therefore, you also need to know the selectivity. There is a selectivity process. By selective, I mean when you go to the store, you select something. The ability, or rather the process of selecting something that is going to benefit you, in this case for the cells, selecting a specific stimulus that is going to work for them. The mice were placed in an apparatus almost like a rolling glove, being held by a machinery that went through the medial frontal cortex that is measuring the brain activity with something called two-photon calcium imaging. At the same time, the mice were being exposed to different images into different sets of rules, kind of like a game. It's kind of like a game of cards where you can match the cards either by shape or by number. For example, here you have cards of spades. You can match them based on the shape regardless of the number. The same thing for the cells. That was one rule. The other rule was, for example, in a card game, matching the cards based on the number, regardless of the shape. You can match them with numbers. And that's kind of what the cells did. There were two rules for the cells: to select and be categorized afterwards. In this experiment, the cells, their rule number one was based on the shading. For example, how shaded a specific area of the images are and how responsive those images will be to the neurons. For example, rule number two, on the other hand, was more about the orientation and in which way the orientation of the images were going would be the result of how the cells would be active. The results show that cells are actually very much selective. For example, here in this graphs, the bottom demonstrates the sessions that the cells had. For example, T5 means rule number one being applied to the game. T8 means rule number two being applied to the game. Here, the vertical line of the graph demonstrates the selectivity of the neurons by percentage. That is, how many neurons were working, or rather, applying the same rule at the same time for a specific stimulus, that being the shading or that being the orientation of the images. Here in T1, rule one is not being affected or is not being implemented by the neurons as they have learned it. So that is why there is not a big percentage of selectivity by the neurons at that moment, because rule one, it's not particularly important. For T5, you can see that neurons were actually very selective during that time with rule one. This means that neurons were applying rule one at a big percentage during a specific stimulus, that being either their orientation or the shading. That is, whether the neurons were either playing the card game by numbers or by shapes. As you can see on the other side of the graph for T8, Rule 2 is being implemented, and the neurons are identifying the game or the stimulus based on rule number 2 at this part of the game. So there's a lot of neurons that are working toward a stimulus or are working toward the same thing based on what they're being shown or what they're seeing, shading or orientation with rule number 2. At this point, rule learning has taken place. As you can see, T5, which is rule number 1, is not particularly important because neurons are not paying attention to that. Neurons are not showing selectivity to that specific rule because it is now they are applying rule number 2 at that moment. The importance of this study and everything else that we've talked today in this video is that neuronal activity in the prefrontal cortex, which as a reminder is in charge of decision making, may explain how neurons work all together and how selective they are. My name is Fernando, and I hope you learned something today.